I'm Don Boozer, coordinator of the Ohio Center for the Book, an affiliate of the Center for the Book at the Library of Congress, based here at Cleveland Public Library. Every year, the State Centers for the Book are invited to select a title to represent their state in the Great Reads from Great Places initiative. And we are proud to announce that we have chosen Jasmine Warga's Other Words for Home as our 2021 Great Reads selection. Jasmine Warga was born and raised in Cincinnati, and Other Words for Home is also partially set in that Ohio city. So with that, I'm very pleased to host this conversation between our author, Jasmine Warga, and the Eva Jane Romaine Coombe Director of the Cincinnati and Hamilton County Public Library, Paula Brehm Heeger, to talk about Other Words for Home, their relationship to the city of Cincinnati, and their connection with each other. So with that, welcome Jasmine and Paula.
Thank you, Don, and thank you so much to the Ohio Center of the Book for selecting Other Words for Home. It still is creates great excitement to me, even hearing the intro announcement again. It's such a wonderful honor. I really am grateful and am so excited to get to celebrate Ohio and books about Ohio and set in Ohio.
That's great. We are pleased as punch to be able to highlight your book as well. So I actually just got done with the audiobook just recently too, and that was a wonderful experience too. I do have to ask, if you don't mind, is everything okay with Judah? Is she did everything work out? Is she good?
You know, I'm going to give you the same answer that I give to the 10 and 11-year-old and 12-year-olds who email me, much to their frustration, which is to say that Jude belongs to the readers now. So I feel like that is sort of the contract between writers and readers, is that the moment the book goes, to print, it is a book that now belongs to the readers. So the way in which a reader imagines the character during the book, as well as what they imagine could happen to the character after the book, is valid, and is more valid maybe even than what my imaginings would be. So yeah, that's where we're gonna leave it. And I always tell them that if I knew, or if I had a strong feeling that they needed to know what I think, I would write another book. But for now, hopefully she lives in your creative imagination.
She's doing well. She's doing well. And I do think that you talk in your bios about being born and raised in Cincinnati, and it does really have a sense of place in the book too. So I'm interested to hear sort of your connection to Cincinnati and your recollections of it, and also your interactions with Paula as the library person there in Cincinnati. And I say person simply because she's had a long career in Cincinnati as well. So
yeah, so I was born and raised in Cincinnati. I was actually born in the neighborhood the novel takes place in Clifton. But then my family, when I was younger, moved to it's such a strange thing, because I think they think of themselves as like their own city, but I think of it as a suburb of Cincinnati, Wyoming, which is part of Cincinnati. And then right before like my 8th grade year, we moved to sort of the Montgomery area of Cincinnati. And so I graduated from Sycamore High School, but my entire childhood and adolescence was spent in Cincinnati. And when I get asked why I said Other Words for Home in Cincinnati, it never occurred to me to set the book anywhere else. In part because I was writing outside of my own life experience, and that I am the daughter of an immigrant, but I've never been an immigrant, let alone a refugee. And but the community that I knew in Cincinnati, what like the immigrant and refugee community I was most familiar with was the Cincinnati one. And so I felt the most comfortable that I could do justice to a story like Jude's if I was writing through that lens and trying and sort of representing this community that is really close to me and that I grew up with and that I knew. And as for how I know Paula, it's really wonderful. I feel like Paula watched me go from like a tween to a full-blown teen. I was a member of the youth advisory board at the library, which was a group of kids from all over Cincinnati who got together to talk about books. And some of us even got to read new books that were coming out. That was my first experience understanding like what an advanced reader copy is. And now, as someone who's on the other side of early reviews, realizes that I maybe perhaps could have been kinder in my cynical 15-year-old gaze at the books. But it was such a special experience. I don't know, Paula, if you have feelings about this, but I was thinking when I knew we were going to talk about how special it was for me, and that I feel like it was really an intersection of Cincinnati, because I grew up in like pretty like the suburban enclaves, and I feel like OTAB, that's like the acronym we used, was such a nice like kind of microcosm of the whole city, and a way for me to meet kids who went to different school districts than I did and lived in different neighborhoods than I did. And sort of that's kind of what the library is, right? It's this community making space. And I feel like OTAB was really sort of emblematic of that.
Jasmine, I love that you remember OTAB. That is so fantastic. I mean, that is, because it was a really special group, and it and Jasmine was involved and also a leader. We should not forget that you were the president of OTAB for a bit there.
Self-proclaimed president, though. I think I walked in anxiety over my college applications, where they were saying like you need leadership roles, and I was like, hey, like, do we have a president? And if we don't, like, can I be the president? Can I put that down? And it was kind of like a friendly coup, I guess. How to be president? But
I think that seems right.
That shows initiative.
Yes, a leader, self-proclaimed or otherwise. You did a great job, and you really were someone who in that group helped everyone feel comfortable. And I did reflect on that when I read the book, because some of your characters, obviously, Jude really didn't always feel welcome, and there were moments and bright spots where people definitely went out of their way, even quietly, Miles, and sort of made sure that there was a comfort there. And the group that you're talking about in a way really where kids, some kids did not come back, some kids really stuck with it. And I think a lot of that has to do with how welcome they felt. And you were definitely someone who was always open and welcome to a variety of different individuals, and it was a special group. And I do have to tell you, we have kids there who still write for me. Shibangle lives out of country. Taylor does missionary work out of country. I see Malcolm and Trent. I mean, those are all kids we know, and I think that formed a special bond. So I do have to say, I could see your kindness reflected in some of the characters and the grace. And Jasmine, you are a fantastic writer. When I read your book, I said to Ned, and Jasmine knows my husband, because occasionally we would do special holiday things, and we would all go out and meet at a restaurant, and he would come along, and I said, man, she's a great writer. You are fantastic. So I just have to tell you how proud I was, and I mean that honestly. That's a great book. It deserves all the accolades received. You are so talented, and I just am so proud of you. I cannot believe that, you were my teen reviewer partner, and I knew that you were special and that you had a lot of talent there, and wow, have you really grown into it. It's great.
Oh, thank
Jasmine,
you.
could you mention? I know the reviewer. I saw some information on that. What exactly was involved in that?
And us reviewing the early copies.
Well, there was that, and also, do I remember that you worked with Paula whenever she was in Yalsa?
Yeah, Jasmine, we would get those galley copies, and I would review it, and Jasmine would review it as the teen reviewer for the Voice of Youth Advocates. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And did that involve any writing, or was that fed into that was?
Yeah, Jasmine, you used to write those paragraphs up, and then you would send them to me, and we would work through them. So, I mean, Jasmine has some actual published reviews there when she was in early high school. So, absolutely.
So, Jasmine, do you have any other recollections from the OTAB? Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes. Yeah. So, well, I have a couple of like favorite memories. We got pizza every meeting, which was really exciting. And, getting back to that idea of just warmness, like I remember it just feeling like a space that was so comfortable, where I feel like so many spaces when you're a teenager, you feel this need to put on a certain kind of mask, like it's a performative space, and you're worried about like how cool you're going to seem or what the dynamics of like the team sport are or whatever it was. But I just remember always feeling really like comfortable and relaxed and looking forward to coming to OTAB, which made it stand out to me and like difference from some of the other activities I did that felt like really high pressure, or I had to, like I said, like perform one facet of my personality more in some way. I felt like I could just really like come as I was to OTAB, and that we would meet at the main branch in downtown Cincinnati, which again was really exciting for me as a kid who was mostly living in the suburbs. And I, like we said, kind of grew up with OTAB. So when I first started, my mom would drive me down and she would just hang out at the library. And then I eventually was able to drive myself. And I had my first car accident in the parking garage of OTAB. And I remember coming and like freaking out to Paula. I was like, no, it's fine. Like that happens to people. But I crashed my car like into the pole of the parking garage. So lots of firsts at OTAB, but I just remember feeling like this main branch of the Cincinnati Library is so like beautiful and it's so big, but it's not a library that I frequented as a kid. Like I spent so much of my childhood at the Bottom Branch Library in Wyoming, Ohio. And when I think about like growing up, I think about that basement story time room that they have. I don't know if it's still the same way. And I think of youth services librarian who, you know, gave me Frindle and gave me Speak, which I didn't really understand. I think I read it a little bit young and then read it later and loved, and just, you know, all of the books that were given to me by that librarian. But the main branch of Cincinnati Library always felt like really special and made me feel giddy to walk in and just see all of those books. And, you know, even then, like I really my dream was to be an author. And so I think there was something that felt so like exciting and kind of sacred about this downtown like library and being there and getting to talk about books and stories. And I feel like also when we were in OTAB, Paul, I don't know if this is like a weird memory to bring up, but I feel like it was like the cusp of the start of the vampire phase.
Yeah.
Because lots of people were really, really into vampire books, but I don't think like Twilight had come out yet, or if it was, our group wasn't talking about it. But people were always asking for more and more vampire books. And then I had been thinking about that just randomly when I was thinking about kind of like what makes trends hit and like a zeitgeist, and being like, so was that in the air before this book came? Because our group was so like poised. If you were taking like a market sample of teens of like what everyone would ask for, like when you had the guys, you'd be like, are there vampires? And so it's just like funny that was just a few years before then. I feel like every book had vampires.
Gosh, that is so true. And I think you're exactly right. We sort of read in the just before that, there was a lot more deeply realistic fiction. And I think some of the books that we reviewed were about, you know, teen angst, but not yet supernatural teen angst included in there. So it is an interesting thing. And I have to say, I love that you mentioned Frindle. And when I think about your book, where words are so important, that's an interesting call out from you, because Frindle, of course, is predicated on the idea of what is the real meaning of a word and who gets to decide, you know, what's a word and what's the authority around that. So that's really interesting that you would bring that one up, because your book is so concentrated on space, but also language. You know, language is such a piece of that. And thinking about what you're saying with OTAB, and I see that reflected in your feelings about the English, the ESL class, and the kids that are there. And I think Mrs. Ravenwood is the teacher, and just how that is like everything is okay and we're all here, and how much that is such an important thing. And you were very social when I remember in the group, and again, very much welcoming kids in. But when I read that, I thought, you know, there probably is an element to all teens, and particularly kids maybe who have a different background than other individuals or that they're aware of. You kind of harbor that little bit feeling of different, or a little bit not always being able to be your authentic self. So I'm really pleased to hear that you felt like, you know, at OTAB, where everybody was just kind of whoever, and there were no pretense. You didn't bring your school, you know, popularity or what was going on in school. It was just being who you were. So that is really, I think that's very special. But I did think about that too when I read your book. and thought through, that special feeling of those kinds of groups and how important they are to a wide range of teenagers, kids who are really different, all the way up to kids who appear or seem outwardly very, very comfortable, but yet inside are not entirely being their authentic self.
Yeah, I really do think that you did such a great job in handling any number of language issues in that. It was you just felt like that you really had a handle on evoking what it was like to not speak English very well, to be part of the ESL, to try, some people were trying to learn Arabic, but then of course the fluent, they were speaking Arabic whenever they were in Syria. So it's like, it was just the regular dialogue and stuff. I am curious, speaking of language, what made you, and I'm sure you've mentioned this before, but what made you want to write the book in verse as opposed to just straight prose?
Yeah, so the book originally wasn't in verse. I've always, thought of myself as a prose novelist. And so for a long time, and at the point the book sold to my editor, it was a prose novel, and we were working on it over and over again in prose. But something about the book didn't feel right to me. I wasn't hearing Jude's voice on the page the way that I wanted it to be for the reader. This kind of gets back to what I was talking about earlier about how once the book is in your hands, there's nothing else I can do to tell you who this character is or what she would sound like. And I realized I was having this really big sort of mental block with it because there's a certain suspension of disbelief that happens in the book, right? And that that Jude is a native Arabic speaker, and probably a lot of her thoughts would be happening in Arabic, but it's a book that's written in English. But I wanted to capture this sort of cadence and lyrical quality that I think Arabic has in a book that was written in English. And I had one of those sort of serendipitous moments of just being like, oh, should this be a book in verse? And then kind of feeling like I was nuts and calling my agent, because the book was really close to being done actually in prose. And we were really far along the process, and her, of course, thinking that I was sounding nuts because that's her job. And we were really close to being done, which is when you get paid, and being like, you want to do what? You want to rewrite the whole book in verse? And then finally, I think she heard something in my voice, like a type of conviction. It was like, okay, send me a couple of pages and I'll see. And I remember being so nervous because my agent, before she was an agent, she was an editor. And another book from my childhood that I loved was called Out of the Dust, which is a verse novel. And Brenda had actually was the editor for that novel. So I knew, she knew about verse novels. And if it was bad, she was just going to tell me. And I was just waiting for this phone call where she kind of let me down gently. And she was like, you know what? You're right. This should be in verse. This is the right choice. And let me call Alessandra. That's my editor. And Alessandra, to her credit, was so game, which is something that I always say why I feel really lucky to work with her, that she really always wants the best version of the book that we can come up with. And if that means, which in this case it did mean, delaying the publication date a couple of seasons, that was worth it to her and to me to be able to try to make the best book possible. But I think it's all about finding the right structure for a story, the right vehicle. And verse novels are really great at showcasing really kind of intimate, emotional stake character type stories, because the voice of the character is really the star. And that was the whole point of the book. I wanted to give a voice to a character like Jude, because I was so frustrated with the way sometimes we read these numbers of kids who are fleeing war zones, and the numbers are so boggling, and we forget that every single one of those numbers is a kid like Jude who has all their unique qualities. And so so I kind of fumbled. So I didn't choose for the book to be in verse. I guess that's a long about answer to it. I fumbled my way into figuring out it needed to be in verse. And now when I psychoanalyze it, can understand that I think I was trying to move closer and closer to that lyrical feel that Arabic has. And it is a language, and it's also a culture that has a long history of really elevating poetry and celebrating poetry. Even Islamic culture is the same way, in that the Quran is written in verses. And so I feel like it just kind of all worked really well that now I see it was meant to be a verse novel. It just took me a long time to figure that out myself.
I think that's great. I think that the fact that you see the rhythm both in the language, the voice that it gave to Jude, and the way that all those things come together, it had to be in verse.
And I love, you were just talking about how we used to read books and there were sort of movements that just hadn't come full circle yet when you were getting into reading teen fiction, and that you mentioned Out of the Dust, which I think that is just such an important message maybe for any teens that are listening or reading your book, to realize, those books that you read when you were younger, they may have influenced and broadened your perspective on what a book can be, on what language can be. That's a fantastic book. That is the coolest connection. That's just another thing I'm like, wow. But that is really cool. And I also love what you were saying about history. And anybody who might live in Clifton would totally have to giggle, where you're like, the exchange with Jude and her mom about how people in Clifton think their houses are so cool because they're so old, and they're 100 years old, and they're like, whatever, that's not really that old, but Americans are so into old things. That is so funny because everyone in Clifton runs around and will say, well, my house, which is 90 years old, it's this sort of thing that is as part of the culture of this community that really enjoys history and tradition. But to your point, putting in the perspective of a culture that has this amazingly long history and these traditions, it is really a fun thing to have read. I really laughed and I thought, gosh, I hope people get this because this is clever.
Thanks. Yeah, that's like totally inspired from my dad, who like could not wait to move out of our old Clifton house because he's like, I don't understand like with Americans, like if I could have a brand new house, he's like, I grew up in a house that was like a building that was like 500 years old, like that. To them, like it is just such a different scope of history. But it's funny you brought up the connections, because I just had a memory of, and I don't know if you're gonna remember this, but when we did a presentation together once, or I was on a panel and I think you moderated it at now what is one of these library conferences I feel like I go to now as an author, but David Levinson was there. And I got a copy of his book, The Realm of Possibility, which is a novel that is in verse, or a lot of it is in verse. And I remember being so captivated by it. And now just like having this thinking right here when you were saying connections of the books that we read when we're younger and how they influence us and make us realize all the different forms that stories can take. But I remember because I think he was giving a talk at the same time as our talk, and you were just like, I want to go to this. I want to go see him talk though. But anyways, I thought I would throw that out as another one of those like funny connections of being introduced kind of to verse novels early on.
Oh, absolutely. Jasmine, I had kind of forgotten that you were on a panel for the Ohio Library Council back in the day. And I honestly think, being a teen, I think you drew a crowd that was, pretty impressive relative to the fact that you were speaking opposite a pretty well-known author. But you just were around books and libraries and literature. And thinking back now, I knew that you would do that. And I think one or two other OTAB members maybe had done that over the years when we had conferences. But that is just a really cool thing to have done. And the fact that you were dedicated enough to books and to the library to do that as a kid, as a teen, is just, think about that now as an adult. That's a pretty heavy ask for somebody to ask a teenager to come to a library council conference, on a Saturday. But you did, and you were fantastic. And I do think that is, gosh, I hadn't thought about that in years, but that is very cool. That is very fun.
Yeah, no, I think about that sometimes when I'll go to now the library conferences, and I'll think about that being my first one, and also the excitement that I had at all of the galleys that they lay out. And I remember like filling my bag up, and then I think when we were at the year we did it was in Columbus, and like my mom of course had driven me up, and we were going out to lunch after, and I remember just like pulling out the books and figuring out which one I wanted to start reading, and just was reading, and she was like, okay, I guess we're not going to talk at this lunch, you're reading your books. I'm like, Mom, well, I got like 20 free books. Of course, I'm going to start
Right.
reading one of them.
That's so yeah, and after I would come back from conference, I would bring the big box of books to OTAB and everyone would be like, I want that one. And there would be a lot of, yeah, that's great, Jasmine. Oh, that's a fantastic story. Thank you for sharing that. That is wonderful.
Oh, that's
That's a
great. No,
coolest memory. I love
that's
that.
great.
Yeah.
So that was your first library conference then?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that would be the first one that I had ever gone to, and it's just so funny now, so many years later, now understanding that it's such a part of the like author circuit to get to go to library conferences and talk to librarians about your book. And having been there as a teen, I think I was advocating for privacy for teens with library cards, for not to be like tracked by their parents, especially like advocating for kids who might be checking out books about like more like sensitive material or things about their identity that they weren't ready to like share with their parents or like teachers, and having that be a place like they could go, I think was kind of the concept of the panel.
Yeah, that does seem correct. You know, I think you also spoke at a funding rally. Didn't you speak at remember that? I think down on Fountain Square, you spoke.
Yes,
You were like
I think I did that as a
speaker.
senior in high school. I remember being really excited about that because there was some vote for raising money for the library, and I talked about how the Cincinnati Library raised me, which is exactly the whole thing that we keep talking about. I think I referenced again Bonham Branch Library at the beginning of feeding my reading life, and that poor youth services librarian who I think I was in there every day being like, do you have something new? What do you have? What should I read? And also, how many books do you have about how to draw dolphins? I was always asking for those things, which, now makes me appreciate, though, which I always say to librarians when I get to talk to them, how much power librarians have, though, for curation for kids. Because when I look back at the books that I read as a kid, it was completely curated by what was being recommended to me by the librarians at that branch. I mean, obviously there was self-discovery of pulling things off the shelf too, but nothing made me more excited about a book than this librarian that I trusted saying, Jasmine, you really have to read this book, like Frindle, which obviously so correct about, but now I see more and understand, like, I guess that world, but when you're a kid, you don't really understand the system of why that would be that way.
Absolutely. And I do have to say too, clearly you use your voice to advocate, and you recollecting back to why you were on the panel, and then when you spoke to those were pretty overt advocacy moments, but your book is really an advocacy voice about trying to see these kids that sometimes are invisible or don't know how to be. And I just think that is something that you as an individual, having known you and watched you just take steps into some areas that other individuals maybe wouldn't have, even as a teenager. That is, your book is right there too. It's beautifully written, but underneath it, it's a call for having people that are invisible be seen and to hear their voice. When I read it, that's how I felt about it. And I think that I can see that knowing you. I just think, wow, you have a really powerful skill there and such a commitment to that. And that is amazingly cool that you also have this amazing talent. So I'm so pleased. But yeah, you always has been a really strong advocate for what you believe in.
Oh, thank you so much. I feel the same way, about you and all youth services librarians. That's why I'm like so excited. I think I like to be in this space, and that I again return to the fact of like how much books meant to me when I was a young person and shaped me and shaped my worldview. And so I like always say I really intentionally write for young people. It's not that is my audience and who I think about as my audience. And I write specifically about these topics for young people because I want them, if they are a kid like Jude, to feel seen. And if they aren't, to hopefully be able to see kids like Jude better and more clearly. And I think that the books I read as a young person did make me a more empathetic person and a person who wants to now do this kind of work of hopefully advocating for others. So Thank you. And like I said, I feel like I learned a lot of that from libraries and from
Yeah.
that space that you created at OTAB. So it is like an ecosystem, right? With like the
Right.
writers and the librarians. That now I better understand how that ecosystem worked than when I was a kid. But I feel so grateful to be a part of it.
I don't think I can think of a better way to sort of end our conversation on that note of self-congratulation for each other. So it sounds like sounds like you created a wonderful atmosphere in the OTAB, Paula, back in the day, and it sounds like Jasmine was a big part of that whole group.
Absolutely. And I have to share one silly story here at the end, Donna, and Jasmine may remember this, but this is kind of a funny blast from the past. Once a year, we would do sort of a celebration outside the library, and I would always want everybody's parents to know what's going on. And so we would write our own invitations. And I can remember having everyone learn to address an envelope in the mail to themselves. And that group of kids, in the like early 2000s or mid 2000s, kind of having everybody now write your return address, and everyone, what is a return address? It was so fun. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk. It is so wonderful to see you, but also to relive some of those fun memories that, they just kind of hang out until you have a chance to talk about them. So Dawn, thank you for inviting me and bringing along, and Jasmine, thank you for everything. And thank you for your book. I look forward to all the work I know you'll do, but gosh, it's cool.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you, Jasmine, so much for consenting to have this conversation. I can't recommend this book highly enough, and I'm looking forward to having it be part of our ongoing list of great reads on the Library of Congress website. It will stick there forever. So thank you so much for that. Thank you for a wonderful reading experience, and thank you again for taking part in this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you again to the Ohio Center for the Book for this honor. Everyone in my house would be able to attest that I haven't stopped talking about it since I got your email. And it's very, very exciting to me. And like I said, I'm so grateful. So thank you.
You are very welcome. Thank you very much, and have a great evening.